Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for your patience today. As you may notice, we're having a little bit of technology challenge. Has anyone experienced any challenge with technology? Yeah, right, very much. Okay, so that's where we are today. So thank you for your patience as we troubleshoot that, but we will get going otherwise because we have a piano and I can play it. So we'll start with that. How many of you, I don't mean to single you out and embarrass you, but how many of you were not here last week? Okay, so a few. I'm going to recap just briefly what we talked about last week. We identified some traits in music which can represent home and can communicate home from the composer to the listener and make us feel a sense of home as listeners, but also make us feel or learn something about the home of the composer. And I have a nice slide for you which you can't read unless you have Superman's eyesight. But hopefully it'll be on a screen eventually. The first one that we identified was that music can communicate an expression of comfort. And we saw in particular that music which that is harmonious, resonant, regular in rhythm, easygoing in tempo, has a particularly strong capability of communicating a sense of home. We heard that in a piece literally called Home by the composer Kevin Putz last time for quartet. With the Miro Quartet, some wonderfully resonant C major chords that open the work. And then the work departs from those chords as it journeys toward a different place. That was an analogy by Putz for the refugee experience, particularly in Europe, of refugees leaving their home and making their way toward Europe. The second way in which we can find home expressed in music is something musicians call literally the home key. In other words, music starts in a particular key, C major, for example, goes away from that key, and often, in 99% of music composed before 1900, comes back to that home key at the end of the piece. It's something that we find as listeners innately satisfying, even if we don't have perfect pitch or we don't know what key the piece is in, we still intuit that the music is coming back to where it has been. Why is that? Because instruments resonate differently in different keys. And even if you don't know, oh, that's A major, we can recognize by ear just instinctively that the music sounds the way it did earlier in the piece. Just the same way as you walk into a familiar environment and you immediately feel comfortable. Our ears do the exact same thing as listeners. And that can be very powerful. And hey, we're getting there. All right. Sort of. There we go. Okay, wonderful. So you may still need good eyesight, but at least it's better than it was. So this is the second point here, that music can have a home key, what is officially called the tonic, but musicians call the home key. Third, we can have a musical theme act as a protagonist in a storyline. Now, it may not be a literal story. We saw an example last week in Beethoven's Cello Sonata in A major, that the theme of the piece, which just consists of a simple interval, a fifth, can appear in many different keys and characters throughout the movement. And so it begins in the home key and departs from it, the theme going into other places with different musical characters, maybe more anxious, worried, defiant, and finds its way back home again at the end of the piece. Just as a person leaves your house or your home in the morning, goes on some kind of adventure, and then comes back to it. So the theme can also play a role in how we perceive a sense of home in music. Finally, and this is one we're going to go into a lot today, is what I'm calling markers of locality, which means sounds associated with a particular place or a particular time. I think the easiest example of that would be folk music, because we associate it with the culture from which it came. And those sounds have a certain association in our ears. We heard an example of that last week at the end of the class with Bridget Kibbe playing Isaac Albeni's Granada, which uses the sounds of Spain, folk idioms, and the sound of the guitar to give one a sense of locality, that you're actually in Spain, that you're hearing the sounds of Spain. And even if you're not from Spain, you know what a guitar sounds like. You might learn to recognize the ornamentation that Spanish composers use in their music. And so those markers of locality can be especially powerful in our ears. We're gonna hear some great examples of that in this week's concerts and next week's concerts. We have a wonderful Syrian clarinetist composer coming, Kenan Ozme. He'll be in our class next week. I'm going to interview him. You're going to hear some of his music, and he will also play. This Saturday, we also have a piece, a commissioned piece from the festival from a young Afghan composer, Arsen Fahim. He's not in town yet. He'll be here at the concert on Saturday, so you'll get to meet him then. But he's from Afghanistan originally and was forced, well, it's a long story. I'll get into it later. Came to this country and is now studying music at the Juilliard School of Music in Boston. But he's going to join us and share some things about his home culture. You're going to hear some sounds of Afghanistan in the 3 pieces on the program of his on Saturday night. And if we have time today, I'll share a little preview of that as well. Now, all of these elements can be mixed together, can come together in different ways. I thought I'd start in the classical period today before we go more toward folk music with some sounds by Franz Schubert. Now, this piece was written in Vienna, where Schubert lived his entire life. And I'm wondering if you feel this theme, which will become the basis for some variations on that theme, has a feeling of home within it. And we might think why. I'm going to just illustrate briefly these 4 elements within this particular piece and how Schubert puts it at ease and gives us a sense of home. So let me move to the piano for that. Let's see here whether I can do this. Okay, well, anyways, I'll jump back and forth so I can toggle. Okay, so the theme to this theme and variations sounds like this. Okay, so that's our theme. I don't know if it puts you at ease. It puts me at ease. Why is that, do you think? Why does it give us a sense that it's at ease and it's comfortable where it is? Any thoughts about that? Yes, it has a lilt. It's in B flat major. Yeah. Mm-hmm. What's that? The speed, it's comfortable, right? We talked about music that's easygoing, gives you a sense of ease and comfort, and it certainly is that. It also stays in its home key. It's very comfortable in that key. It does not appear to want to leave that key. It begins in the key, it ends in the key. Yes, Susan? Yes, it does.
In the second major phrase, really is the first one with the
Yes, it's a great point. You mentioned the lilt. And that's something we associate in particular with Austrian dance music. The waltz and a country dance called the Ländler often have that lilting quality. And Schubert uses that very often in his music to give what I would call a marker of locality. In other words, you're in Austria, you're in Vienna, and you kind of feel that. Even some of the ornamentation, if any of you have heard yodeling, it's a little bit like that. gives us a feeling of comfort and ease and a little bit of a quality of folk music. Schubert does that very subtly. Composers in the later 19th century would do it more overtly and deliberately. I think Schubert does it in part just kind of naturally because that's the sound of the music that was in his ears. But if we look, we see a lot of these elements, expressions of comfort, harmonious resonance, stays in the home key. I'll come back to this one, markers of locality. They're all there in the theme. Now, Schubert is also going to use the home key to create a sense of musical journey. He's going to start in the home key and end in the home key, but he's going to depart from it. And his theme is going to start to move when it goes into the first variation. So you have that feeling of the lilting rhythm. Now that's going to change just a little bit in the first variation. So here he adds 16th notes, and I think let's see if I can give you, for those of you who read music, this is the theme, and he marks it very specifically tema, or theme. You'll notice now we have more black notes, right? So the music is moving. It's almost like, okay, we're going. We're going somewhere. It stays in the home key, so it's still easygoing and comfortable. But as the music goes along, it's going to pick up energy and start to go through a little bit more of a series of adventures. The second variation is also in the home key, but it becomes even more lively. Now, if we listen closely, we can still hear that this is related to the theme. Let me play a little bit of the theme again. And again, the second variation. It starts on the same scale degree as the theme. It's just a variation of it. In other words, there are notes around it, added to it, but we still identify it as the same person, right? Because it sounds similar, but now it's moving, it's going somewhere. Now, in the fourth variation, he changes the key, and it goes into minor. We still have the third scale degree that we were using before, the third note, do, re, mi of the scale, but now it's in minor, and the character changes profoundly. This is something we can all relate to, right? Your day's going fine, everything's great, but then the dark thoughts come, or the clouds pass over, and suddenly you're thinking about all the terrible things that might happen or have happened, or worry, anxiety comes in. This is something Schubert dealt with himself. He was suffering from a terminal illness, essentially, at the time, syphilis, and was quite convinced by the time he wrote this piece that his life would not be very long. So that continues for quite a while. It's rather lugubrious. And then he does something quite interesting, which is he moves from this minor key, B flat minor instead of B flat major, to G flat major. And suddenly it's like we've gone into an imaginary place, a place of dreams, or something which is much calmer, maybe not real as much as imagined. It sounds like this. So if I play the home key again, it sounded, our home key was this key, and now we're here. It's just a different sound world. Now again, you don't need to have a degree in music theory to understand that that sound is just very different. And that's what our ears do. They're able to perceive these differences of key in terms of, keys are like places that you go and return to. Now at the end of this variation, as we get into the last one, Schubert finds his way back to the home key, and he couldn't be happier once he gets there. There's a wonderful transition moment where these notes flowing in the bass go to the top in the last variation, and we find our way back to B flat major. It sounds like this. There's a sense of ease again, and lightness, and fancy. Now at the end of this variation, to the very end, and this is the part I want to focus on the most, we come to rest. And Schubert writes here lento, which means slowly. And the music floats down from the very highest part into the lowest register, into a kind of hymn-like series of chords, as the music comes to rest, the way that we literally do when we come home at the end of the day, and everything slows down, and your heart rate slows down. Listen to how he does that in musical form. This is a wonderful representation of the feeling of home in music. It's not a programmatic piece, it's just called impromptu, but Schubert has really given us these sensations that I described to you earlier of home. He's done all of them for us within the context of this piece. Now, as we get into the 19th century, these ideas will become much more explicit as composers write music which is more programmatic and has storylines and is more deliberately connected to their home culture. So I'd like to move forward a little bit in time to the composer I mentioned last time, but we didn't really have time to look into, which is this guy, Frédéric Chopin. Here he is in 1829. I mentioned briefly last time that he left his home in 1829 for the first time, and he did not realize that he would actually never return to it. It's a long story, but Poland had been partitioned at that time, and his portion was under Russian occupation. When there was an uprising in 1830, Chopin had just left for Vienna. He was in Vienna when he heard stories of the brutality that was taking place as the Russian army violently repressed the people of his home region. Chopin decided not to return to Poland, where he had grown up playing in environments like this one. and decided instead to embark on a concert career. However, when he was in Vienna, he wrote back to his family saying that my piano right now hears nothing but mazurkas. In other words, he couldn't stop playing and creating specifically Polish music. The mazurka is a very Polish folk dance. I say very Polish because unlike the Polonaise, which was more of an international dance, the mazurka is really, really identified strongly with Poland. And it was that dance that Chopin turned to. He wrote mazurkas for the rest of his life. It's actually the only genre in which he continued to write from that moment until his death. And maybe it was a kind of musical therapy for him of sorts, that he wrote these mazurkas when he could not be home. They represented home to him, but they also represented the pain of separation from his family, first and foremost, who he almost never saw again in the rest of his life. They met in Germany a couple of times, but that was an arduous journey for him as well from Paris. But it also represented this homesickness. In fact, there was one time when Chopin was playing some of these mazurkas in a salon in Paris, and Franz Liszt was there, other great composer. He was listening to Chopin play, and one of the aristocrats asked Chopin, like, what are you trying to express in your mazurkas? They seem so sad. And Chopin tried to explain it, and he kept coming back to the same Polish word, the Polish word żal, which does not have a translation directly into English, but is kind of a combination of several emotions: longing, regret, nostalgia, melancholy, grief, unease, all of these things kind of wrapped into one. And Chopin explained that, this had to do with his separation from his homeland. And the mazurka was a way for him to engage both his positive memories of home, which definitely comes through. Not all the mazurkas are sad. Some of them are quite joyful. But also this nostalgia that had a more melancholy side to it. So I wanted to introduce you to one mazurka. Again, this is a folk dance. Maybe if I'm lucky and our technology works, I can show you just a little bit of what the mazurka is like. There are several kinds of mazurka. Oh, I should say that first, forgive me. Oh boy. Not more technology problems. The dreaded dark screen. No, there it is. Okay, good. So the mazurka is a Polish folk dance. It's always in triple meter. And it typically has an emphasis on the offbeats, either the second beat or the third beat of the bar, rather than the downbeat. The waltz, by comparison, always has a strong downbeat because you take a big step on the downbeat and then you go up on your toes. The mazurka is very different. It has accents and slaps and hops and stomps that are not on the strong beat. And that's the definition of mazurka. There are three kinds of mazurkas. I don't want to get into this too much, but there's a medium, slow, and a fast mazurka. Okay, the mazur, which is actually sort of the medium one, has very surprising accents and is very temperamental. It's like somebody whose mood changes suddenly, very quickly. Then you have the slow, tuneful kujawiak, which is a more lyrical dance, and I'll play one of those for you. And then the oberek, which comes from to spin. It literally means to spin around. That's the one there. So just a little inkling of what those mazurkas look like, if I'm lucky here. My computer can survive. I'll show you just a little bit of the dance itself. I wonder if this will work. Let's see here. Okay, let's hope. One, two, three. You can see the accents on the offbeats. Here's a little bit of the Oberek, which is a faster dance. See the spinning. Okay, now this is a modern setting, but it gives you an idea of the kind of situation in which you would hear a mazurka. A group of people, maybe in the town square, dancing together. There's a social aspect to it. Now, what Chopin did is he took the mazurka and he personalized it. And he left the markers of locality, as we discussed before, in communicating a sense of home. In other words, you can tell it's a mazurka, but he makes it more personal to his experience. And that's typical of the 19th century, where we see composers referencing their homes, but it's through the prism of their personal feelings. And I'd like to give you an example of that in some music. So this is one of Chopin's mazurkas that he wrote in Vienna shortly after that Polish uprising, when he wrote to his family that he couldn't stop writing mazurkas. There are some various traits of home that one finds in Chopin's mazurkas, and I'll lay them out for you here. The first is what Chopin himself said, a feeling of jal, that he was separated from his home. He knew he could not go back there. And just by way of passing, I'll point out that Chopin was actually not allowed to be living in Paris. France had a treaty with Russia, and technically the Polish people were not supposed to settle in Paris, but he did, illegally. Anyways, they also can communicate a sense of memory, recollection, comfort, how things were when they were good, right, in youth, childhood. They also can convey a more nationalistic element, a sense of pride, strength, courage, resistance. Music can do that as well. And finally, as you saw in the Oberek that was danced, a sense of joy, celebration, togetherness. There's a social aspect. So Chopin's music can do all of these things, and I thought I'd pick one that I think touches on most of these elements. This is his mazurka in A minor, Opus 7, number 2, again composed in Vienna when he was in that rather tortured state, not knowing, should I go back home and help with the resistance effort there, or should I continue my musical career? He decided to continue it, lucky for us. The music, I think, does start with a sense of jal in that it's a little bit uneasy. There are no harmonies on the downbeat, and the music is rather temperamental, to pick up on one of the traits I mentioned before. The opening theme of the mazurka. Now, the music suddenly becomes very chromatic, which is not something you're going to find in folk music. Okay, folk music usually is relatively simple. It's functional. But here he uses this kind of dark harmonies to express some of these more intense emotions. I'll play that next section. Now, in this next section, Chopin writes dolce, which means tenderly or sweetly. And here we have a little bit more of this feeling of memory. The music goes into a major key, almost as if you're recollecting a happy memory. And Chopin keeps going back to it again and again, like the same memory that he can't let go of. then suddenly the music becomes very bold, very strong, and communicates this sense of pride, strength, courage, resistance, stubbornness. It may have a slightly nationalistic element here. Poland, again, continually stomped on by other countries. So here we have Chopin really expressing quite a lot in a very short amount of time. This mazurka is only a couple minutes long, as most of the mazurkas are. Any other observations about what you feel when you're listening to this music? I mean, I know that's personal too, but your reaction is as helpful as mine in this regard.
I
Yes.
feel like with Chopin, because I play some Chopin,
Mhm.
I feel when I play Chopin as opposed to Beethoven or Bach or Mozart, that you're like having a conversation with him. You're actually like feeling what he's feeling,
Yes.
which is very unusual actually.
Yeah. The 19th century composers admired Chopin a lot because the music felt both personal and universal at the same time. It felt very much like his thoughts and feelings. And at the same time, you know, he's drawing upon these folk dances and a sense of national pride, which later composers also wanted to express in their music. And so bringing those together was a great achievement, I think, by Chopin, and one reason why he was so influential. Yes?
This is beautiful. You know, it reminds me so much of the life of John Paul II.
The nationalist Polish leader.
Yeah. I mean, he was very much into music, and he had a very difficult life.
Yes.
All through his life.
Mm-hmm.
It just reminds me of that.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes, it's a story that, you know, Chopin was by no means the only one to experience these thoughts and feelings. And Chopin, you know, his music is so individual and intimate in a way in many cases. He didn't have an opportunity to be a leader or a fighter the way some of these other people did in his home culture. But I think he hoped that his music would stand for that, for his culture. And it really has, actually. He's still a hero in Poland today in these ways. He was able to capture the sensibility of the culture and the character of the people there. People still feel that's true today in Poland, if you ask them about Chopin. And so it stood as a way of an example, I guess, for later generations. People like Antonin Dvorak. Here's Dvorak writing about Chopin's music. Chopin alone caused the music of Poland to be known and prized by all lovers of music. Smetana, he's talking about Bedřich Smetana, Czech composer, did the same for us Bohemians. He's calling his region Bohemia. Today, we would call that the Czech Republic, but that's the general area. And Dvorak says here, all that is needed is a delicate ear, a retentive memory, and the power to weld the fragments of former ages together in one harmonious whole. Sounds easier than it is, I think. But one of the reasons he's writing this in Harper's Magazine in 1895 is because he was brought to this country to teach American composers how to compose music that reflected their home. Because, well, why would they even do that? that's a story in and of itself. And actually, it begins in upstate New York, so that's why one reason I wanted to highlight it. The other is that later this week, we'll hear the Dover Quartet play the so-called American Quartet by Dvorak, and that's where we're headed. This woman, Jeanette Thurber, was a very fine musician. She studied in Europe, and she came back to this country and had the good fortune to marry a very successful grocer in upstate New York. She was originally from Delhi. Has anybody been to Delhi? Oh, great. Okay. All right. Well, she put her money to good use supporting music. And she founded what music school you probably have never heard of because it's now defunct. But it was called the National Conservatory of Music. She founded it in 1884, and it survived until about 1920. She helped raise additional money from Andrew Carnegie, who I'm sure you've heard of, Carnegie Hall. She sponsored this New York City's first Wagner Festival. She was a big supporter of the arts. Anyways, she recruited 84 students in her first year, and she was quite unusual in that she allowed both women and black students to attend. And here she is in her office at the National Conservatory. She felt that they needed a new composition teacher, and the idea of classical music in the United States at the time was very Eurocentric. Everyone was looking to Europe for culture. That was probably true in the decorative arts. You know, if you go to the Washington Square Park in New York City, you see that famous arch. That's modeled on the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, right? All of the architecture from the time is really, taken from Europe in one way or another. And it was the same in classical music. So Jeanette Thurber sent one of her friends over to Europe to try to persuade Dvorak to come to the US. Part of the reason was because he seemed to have so successfully expressed his home in his music through his Slavonic dances, his symphonies, and all of his wonderful pieces. And so her friend went armed with a giant paycheck, $15,000, which is a lot of money in 1892. And Dvorak was indeed persuaded to come to this country and teach at the National Conservatory of Music. He rented a townhouse not too far away. This is around Union Square. Here he is with his family in his new home on East 17th Street. The building, I believe, has been demolished. Unfortunately, it was demolished by Beth Israel Hospital. That's a different story. Anyways, he was near the school, and he was very, clear about his goals in 1892. Why am I here? I came to discover what young Americans have in them and help them to express it. The new American School of Music must strike its roots deeply into its own soil. Now, this brings up an interesting question. What would American music that reflects our home here sound like? What could be ways in which composers might pick up on the traits of American music? If we go back to those few traits, what would you imagine composers here could do to help their music sound American? It's an interesting question, huh? I know it's a little bit abstract.
I would think that he would have to travel and listen to the various kinds of music that are being generated from, I don't know how far his reach would be, but...
You're absolutely right. The first question he asked was, well, what is your local music? And he went through it and tried to figure out, well, let's see, which of your local music might be really a good basis for these markers of locality to express your home. And so he thought about that for a while, and he wrote about it too. He said, the melodies of the Negro people, the songs of Creoles, of Native Americans, their chants, maybe even the plaintive ditties of Germans or Norwegians. He's thinking about immigrants here, because New York City was a huge center of immigration at that time. The melodies of whistling boys, street singers, and blind organ grinders. Okay? So those were a few of his initial thoughts about where he might look. Okay? The place that he started was, he thought, well, the Native American peoples here, they were here first. And what could I find out about them? Well, unfortunately, he did not have a lot of sources of information about that. Where he went. This is too bad, but it's just this was the situation in the 1890s. Yes, Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. He attended in the 1890s. Okay, so this is not really an authentic representation of Native American culture nor music. Now, there were Native American peoples living in New York City at the time, so he had some very minor interactions, including musicians, but he did not really have access to authentic Native American music. So that was a little bit of a dead end for him. He did try to portray in his music some of the themes of Native American culture, the Song of Hiawatha in particular, based on the Longfellow poem. But he found a much better source, which was the African American spiritual. And there he was very fortunate that shortly after he arrived, someone presented him with a music critic in New York who said, well, I hear you're looking for sources of American music. There was an article just published by this guy, Johann Tonsor, it was actually written by a woman, Mildred Hill. She was a musician from Kentucky, but you couldn't get your work published as a woman at that time, so she used all these stories are sort of amazing to me. Anyways, she not only wrote about African American spirituals, but she actually notated some of them. And Dvorak got to know one, including this one here. Anybody recognize it? Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Right, so this is in the 1890s, it's a long time ago. There really isn't any notated music of spirituals at this point. It's really just, you learn them by ear from the people who sing them to you. Dvorak picked up on this right away, and in his music, started using the same notes and the same configuration. This is the beginning of his string quartet, the so-called American quartet. And I'll play just the opening bars of it. You can listen to it compared with the spiritual you just heard. Actually, I think I have the Dover Quartet to play this for you, so let's listen to a little bit. They're playing in a living room, so the sound is not ideal, but gives you a close-up on the quartet that'll be joining us in 2 days. Okay, let's just take a listen to that very beginning and look at the notes there for one moment. Play the notes on the screen here for you. Notice, first of all, he starts the melody in the viola. Okay. Now we just heard, we were hearing before, listen again. They're the same notes that were used in this article. We actually have Dvorak's handwritten notation of that article I showed you, and he writes notes in the margins, and at one point one of his children wrote upside down because he was at the desk, he wrote, "I love you, Daddy," underneath. So Dvorak really studied this article on spirituals very intensely, And it's no, secret we find in the same key, the exact same notes, but reconfigured in his own way, placed right here in the viola part. So we can see that Dvorak really wanted to make an effort, to illustrate in his own music how American composers could proceed. Now, is there anything else about this music you just heard that gives us a feeling of home? It certainly does. It stays right in the home key. You can see, look at the cello here. What does it do? It just holds the home note, F, for many, many bars, and actually continues beyond that after a couple little notes at the end there. That's one of the markers of home we've seen, is that you just stay in the same key and you feel comfortable. So that's something to listen for sure. Yeah. Anything else? Well, to my ear, the viola is an interesting choice. First of all, Dvorak played the viola himself. That was his instrument. But giving it to the viola, which has a little bit more of a rustic quality, it's a little lower down, it's not as ethereal as the violin, gives you a little bit of a feeling of the outdoors. And then the violins, which play this sort of tremolo sound, also that kind of familiar din of the outdoors, whether it's the sounds of birds or something in the background. And all of these traits combine together to make us feel very comfortable at the start of this work. Now, in the second movement of the work, Dvorak turned to something which is more plaintive. He draws upon the quality of the spiritual here as well. The music is, he writes molto espressivo, so very expressive. It's in a minor now, which most spirituals are. Swing Low, Sweet Chariot is a little, I don't want to say unusual, but many spirituals are actually in a minor key. One of the ones that most impressed Dvorak was the spiritual called Go Down Moses. You may know the words to that. We discussed it last year in reference to our Harriet Tubman project, because they used to sing that on the Underground Railroad. It ends with the words, let my people go. Right, thinking back to Moses and the Egyptians. But Dvorak's assistant at the National Conservatory of Music was this man, Harry Burleigh. Does anybody recognize his name? Anyways, Harry Burleigh was a talented singer, and he was the grandson of enslaved people, and his maternal grandmother sang spirituals to him, and then he sang them for Dvorak. And one of the ones Dvorak really liked was Go Down Moses. And that has some broad similarity to the second movement of the American Quartet. I'll, again, let the Dover Quartet play a few notes of that for you. For stopping it just in the interest of time here. Here, Dvorak uses the notes often used in spirituals. One of the main things in musical terms is that the 7th scale degree, instead of being raised, as it often is in minor, is actually lowered. Those of you who know the New World Symphony would recognize. Same sound. In Go Down Moses, the last part is let my people go. So it's the same series of notes. And Dvorak is using these markers of locality in the music to express what he wants to do. It might also express something about the environment where he composed it. This piece was actually composed in Iowa. If you can imagine Dvorak in Iowa. It's quite an image. He went to Iowa because another one of his helpers in New York was from the small Czech town, well, it was full of Czech immigrants, in Spillville, Iowa, which is as small as it sounds. And Dvorak went there on holiday one summer in 1893. He took his whole family with him, and he was amazed by the place. He was very comfortable there, very happy there, right from the start when he got there. He started writing a piece when he got there. He finished sketching the piece in 3 days and finished the whole thing in 12 days, and that was this so-called American String Quartet, Opus 96, which we'll hear on Thursday night with the Dover Quartet. He, on his walks in the community there, out in nature, he started writing down the sounds of a bird. It turned out to be this bird. The scarlet tanager. I think I have a sound of it here for you. I don't know if you can hear it. It's kind of light. Okay, that's a little too hard to hear. Anyways, it has a particular call which Dvorak notated down and then put into the 3rd movement of his quartet, which we'll hear just a fragment of here, in the interest of time. He specifically wrote in the score, this is the bird that he had heard. And he takes the sound of the bird, especially 2 notes of the bird call, and uses it throughout the movement as the primary theme. You can see those notes here in the high part, and then in the violin, this really sounds very much like the bird call I just played, even though it's hard to hear. Which you hear over and over in this piece. Let me see if I can play just a little fragment of it for you. So there you have it. The sound of the bird is the basis for this movement. And it reminds us that, well, we often think of home as an indoor place. A lot of us feel quite comfortable outside in nature, too. Actually, where some people feel the most comfortable. And so there is this quality of pure harmony in it. It stays in the same key, and that bird call gives the atmosphere of the piece. Now, of course, there was another composer who used bird sounds, and we're going to hear his music this week as well in Saturday's concert, Beethoven's so-called Pastoral Symphony No. 6. And I think Dvorak probably got the idea from Beethoven, because at the end of the 2nd movement, Beethoven, who wanted to express in his symphony the feelings that nature gives you, the feelings of comfort, of joy that you feel when you go out into nature, in music, he identified 3 bird sounds right in the score. These are Beethoven's words. Nachtigall, which means nightingale. Wachtel, which means, oh boy, I just blanked on what that means. And the cuckoo here. Thrush, and the cuckoo. And so he identified those in the score. I'll just play a little bit of what that sounds like for you. This is at the end of the second movement. So here comes the nightingale now. Cuckoo. The first movement of this piece, Beethoven writes in the score a description of what he's trying to convey, and he says, the feelings of comfort and joy that one feels upon arriving in the countryside. For Beethoven, he did not always feel comfortable in society, and you may know that he was sort of famously gruff and created a lot of problems for people. But when he was able to escape Vienna and go to the town of Heiligenstadt, which is just outside Vienna, you can visit it today, and it pretty much looks the same. Although you see some smokestacks in the distance that you didn't see in the 19th century. Beethoven would walk along this road. He loved to compose there. He rented a house where he composed this symphony. He would walk in the countryside and notate in his notebook themes that came to him in his mind, and including the beginning of the Sixth Symphony, which sounds like this. And that became the representative of these feelings that one feels when one is really comfortable in the countryside. Let me just play the very opening of the orchestral version for you. I want to point out that if you hear the low part, just like in the Dvorak quartet, what Coco pointed out, it's just this note in the bass. In other words, it's happy in the home key and it does not want to leave it. It's joyful, it's peaceful, it has all of those qualities we associate with home. But for Beethoven, that home happened to be the outdoors and not necessarily always with other people. I know we're out of time, and I'm sorry we got a little bit of a late start. I just wanted to make a closing remark about the concert this coming Saturday. We have a remarkable young Afghan composer who's going to be with us. I mentioned his name earlier, Arsen Fahim, born in 2000. That always seems so impossibly young to me. But anyways, I guess there were people born in 2000. But his story is so compelling. He was born in a refugee camp in Pakistan because during the 90s, there was a civil war in Afghanistan. The Taliban came to power in 1996 until 2001. Famously, the US military took over the country. And Arsen was sent to an orphanage. He's here in the baseball cap. And when he was in the orphanage, he heard a movie playing called The Pianist. I don't know if anybody has seen that movie. It's directed by Roman Polanski. It's about a World War II pianist of Władysław Szpilman, Polish pianist, who miraculously survived, even though he was Jewish and stuck in Europe at the time. Anyways, he heard the music and was so fascinated by the Chopin Nocturne that he decided he wanted to be a musician. And when he was able to go back to Afghanistan in 2012, he studied at the New Afghan Institute of Music, which was a place to study both Western classical music, so-called Western, and also traditional Afghan music. He learned the piano there. And then, after a few years, he applied for study here in the United States and had received an acceptance letter. And he was able to leave. He left just days before the U.S. pulled out of Afghanistan and the Taliban took power. I don't know how much you know about the Taliban, but they do not like music. In fact, they outlawed music altogether. And the punishments for playing music are pretty gruesome. I don't want to really share them all with you, but removing the body parts with which you play music is one possible punishment. Anyways, Arsen has made it a goal of his, kind of like, I mean, the analogy to Chopin is a little bit apt in that Chopin also was separated from his home country, but often wrote in the musical genres of his home country. Arsen does the same. He uses Afghan folk sounds in his music, including in one piece which will be played here on Saturday called Forbidden Dances. Forbidden because they're forbidden by the Taliban to be played in his home country. And maybe I can leave you with a few sounds of those dances. He's also going to be, or has written 2 new pieces for us. One, an arrangement of an Afghan folk song, and secondly, an original piece which has a wonderful title to it. It's called Memories of a Place I've Never Been. Here's a little bit of Arsen. First of all, talking about these dances, and then a few sounds of what we'll hear on Saturday night. Then I'd be happy to take any questions and join you for a glass of wine, since you've been so patient.
And I'm trying to take inspiration from the beautiful traditional music of Afghanistan and the beautiful traditional dances, and trying to bring them into a different setting. It's not just about the beauty of those dances and music that I cherish so much. It's also just about the tragedy of not being able to have these different dances and music right now. Hopefully this piece can be a way to raise awareness about that and to express both the beauty and joy of it, but also just the tragedy of having to do this while inside of not being able to do it inside of our country.
It's a sad but a powerful story. He mentions his home, and you can hear the emotion in his voice as well. So here's just a little bit of some of those dances that we'll be hearing on Saturday night. Okay, so I think we'll leave it there. Thank you for staying a little longer. I'm glad you didn't all get up to leave. There's so much to talk about in music and the music we hear this season, but this is a start for this week. The Dvorak American Quartet, the pieces you'll hear on Saturday night by Kenan Ozmeh, the Syrian clarinetist composer, and also by Arsen Fahim, the Afghan composer. Next week, we'll have one of the composers, Kenan, with us here, along with the Claremont Trio, to discuss the new piece that they'll be playing together by Kenan, also commissioned by the festival, in next week's concerts. So we hope you'll join us again next week. Are there any questions before we finish? I'm sorry I didn't save more time for that, but I'd be happy to take any questions you'd like to ask now. Okay, well then let's go have a glass of wine, and you can ask me personally. Thank you, everyone.